Good even. Good evening and welcome to Game Master's Guide. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and today we're going to be talking about the people you have at your table. Now, before we get started, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel so you can be updated every time something new comes up. And you definitely want to do this because although it doesn't cost you a penny, it definitely helps the channel to reach more people and we get the message out to the other GMs and get everybody's games greater.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
All right, so we're going to be talking about all the different kind of people that play role-playing games. Now, we've covered them several different times with a different kind of an angle, looking at what players are like when they first get started and how we deal with the newness of it. But we're going to be looking in today in particular on those people that are in your campaign on a weekly basis. I'm going to be kind of giving some insight into what kind of personalities you might have and to perhaps assist you in figuring out how best to keep them entertained and engaged in the games that you're running. Of course, every game master is different and your mileage may vary, as the saying goes, but we are going to be looking at them from the standpoint of describing what it is they're looking for in the game and how best you can meet those expectations. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the storage sponges. And that sounds almost negative because we think of a sponge as just being something that soaks stuff up. But the reality is that quite a few people that come to the table come for the explicit understanding of what you have in your head and are trying to draw conclusions between the different adventures that you provide them with to try to get an insight of what's going on in the story. Now, it's fairly easy to maintain a story sponge in the game by simply providing new information, insights, perhaps some morals to the story as you go. But the point is that they thrive on the newness of the information. So you want to try to always be keeping your adventure on an ongoing pathway. If you get bogged down in particular scenes or communities or situations, you can a story sponge might lose their attention span. And we've talked before about why players might leave your group, but more importantly, you want to find ways to make them thrive. And having story sponges really gives you an opportunity to ensure that the information you're providing is getting feedback, because those players are going to be the ones that will be responding to your story beats and trying to figure out how best to keep the story moving. Next, you have the monster hunter, and this is the person who has played the game for a while and is looking for marks to put on their sword scabbards, so to speak, ticking off their victories and, as a friend of mine used to say, going to strange and wonderful worlds, finding their creatures and destroying them. The idea of the monster hunter is that there needs to be something to kill. There needs to be some fight scenes involved. Now, Nikos RPG doesn't necessarily focus on the actual elimination of creatures unless they're particularly dangerous, and so instead you might find ways to capture, capitalize on, and release your creatures. So the idea of the monster hunter's approach isn't necessarily lethal, but what they are looking for is uniqueness and interest in the monster variety you provide. Arguably, world building is about understanding how the different biologies work and how the different species interact. And having a monster hunter in your group, you're going to definitely want to keep that flow ongoing. Fortunately, in the fantasy environment, it's virtually infinite in possibilities and scope, but it's really important to provide the monster hunter with their dose, if you will, of the pursuit, investigation, discovery, and elimination of those monsters in new and interesting ways. Of course, many of your adventuring players have a dramatic bent, and it's important to also provide for a richer social structure than you might ordinarily concern. I've got players who simply come for the shopping sprees. They want to go and investigate and interact with people in the process of commerce. They like the concept of the haggle, and by providing enough space for them, the social butterflies can really flourish. They're particularly useful when you've got a large community that you're trying to gather information from, and they're willing to engage with and interact with the people of the community to gather that information. So it's really fun when you have several social butterflies, because they will interact with each other and with the community and really enrich the experience for everybody involved. Now, as before, I've mentioned the variety. If you have, if all the players in your group are social butterflies, then your dramas will be extensive, but your combat might be shallow. So just realize that you need to be able to be diverse in terms of what you are doing within your sessions, so that everybody gets their, as the saying goes, itch scratched. Of course, then you have the scientists. And these, when I'm using the term scientist here, I'm not saying that it's actually a botanist or whatever, but the idea of the scientist is that he's looking for how things interact and what dynamics are in play that are providing the stresses in the system. And they want to play with those systems and discover new information that may not have been available. When you have a scientist at the table, he's going to be more concerned with why the monster is where he is, what motivated him to make his attacks, why he doesn't have other food sources, for example. And all of these elements are not necessarily something you think of initially when you create the characters and the adventure, but they are things that you want to continue to amplify so that you can keep the scientist engaged. And the biggest benefit of the scientist is that he's going to help you do the world building richness that you may not have originally intended. Quite often when you're building an adventure, especially when you're a relative novice as a game master, you're not even sure what should be allowed, and so therefore having a scientist in the group, it really helps to drive the story forward by perhaps investigating some of those outliers that would change the way the players interact. Of course, you have those that are scorekeepers, and by that I mean they step into the game going, I measure how much money I have, I measure how much wealth I have, I measure how many items I have, I measure the number of times that we actually got in a fight this last adventure. And a scorekeeper is a helpful piece of the puzzle when it comes to overall play, because it makes sure that you keep your adventure driving forward. But the scorekeepers also can be helpful in guiding other players on what their advances should be, because not everyone plays again for the same reasons, and having scorekeepers among your group really help to draw forward the projection of what's going on in the game. Like the scientists, they are interested in what is the progression of the game and whether there is forward movement. And by having scorekeepers as part of your group, even if they're not the major player, they nonetheless help to keep a running tally of what's going on in the game. Now, always useful. Of course, one of my favorite persons in the group will be the interpreter, and that's the person who sees the experiences in the game and puts them into metaphoric positioning. They are able to say, oh, well, that happened because of this, or that monster had this material gathered for a particular thing, and therefore they are your 2 + 2 = 4. They're the ones who actually help you to translate the actions that you intend for the game into the player's comprehension and awareness. And interpreters are not necessarily talking about languages here. We're talking about perceived interpretations of what goes on in the game. As the game is dependent upon dice rolling, the interpreter is also the one that can suggest that, for example, there is a darkness about a place simply because the die rolls have been bad in that location, and they help to build the ambiance and the feel of the game even as they are gathering the information, perhaps, I wouldn't say in an errant way, but they are utilizing narrow amounts of information and building broad story elements into the game for you. If you've heard anything about the games that I run, you're going to find that there are a lot of people who are librarians. And this term doesn't necessarily refer to someone who is an aficionado at lore collection, but a librarian is somebody who draws conclusions from information, and therefore they look for sources of that information. Maybe they're looking for books, maybe they're looking at the inscriptions on the walls. In any way they can gather information and categorize it and collect it, they're going to do so. And librarians can be a hoot to play with if you provide them with a broad spectrum library to dig into and allow them to pursue the course they want to in the information, because naturally their thought processes aren't necessarily the ones that you intended for them to have, and so therefore the story that they build is going to be more amplified by the information that they've gathered in this way. Now, by and large, in a large swath, a lot of your players are investigators, at least in some form, but the concept here of the investigator at your table is the person who is going to ask all of the questions. He's not going to be satisfied with the this happened because of X. He's going to look for additional clues. He's going to look for things that have happened in the background. Perhaps he's going to do some local research and discover and uncover things that can allow you as a game master to really amplify the play. A good investigator is not only going to draw in information, he's going to kick over the doors and try to find the new information that hasn't yet been revealed, because to the investigator, there's something still missing. There's always something else to explore. Now, when it comes to players who make decisions, a decision maker is a person who doesn't necessarily need a lot of information. He listens to the introduction, he listens to a bit of the establishing shot, and immediately chooses an action. In the most extreme cases, you'll have somebody who ends up being sort of a Leroy Jenkins and just jumps out to do. But for the most part, decision makers are really going to be honing in on moving past the almost natural tendency for analysis paralysis. When you provide a scene and a description and details, sometimes a player will get caught up in the nuances and spin their wheels, so to speak. And I've had entire groups spend 2, 3, 4 sessions in a specific environment just because they can't really make a decision. And having decision makers in your party really ends up helping, even if they are, as I said, the Leroy Jenkins, even if they do press the envelope and push the story in directions you may not have expected. The decision makers really do provide the rest of the group with motivation and action, which of course drives a lot of really great encounters. And finally, of course, you can have your conspiracy theorists. Now, if you are running a game that is not based on conspiracies and there's a straightforward story, you'll be able to tell your conspiracy theorist, because he's going to draw conclusions that may not have any evidence behind it. He's going to draw assumptions from the NPCs that you run into, and the story itself becomes for them the mystery that needs to be solved, even if you didn't write any mystery into it. Granted, the conspiracy theorists can run your story far afield, and generally are the ones who succumb fairly easily to the red herrings you might put before them. But by having the conspiracy theorists in your game, you're definitely going to have a lot of interest about what's going on in the story, and the mechanism for that will be, of course, their ability to convince other players to act. So now the question is, who's at your table? Looking at the list that I've described, are there any of the people that clearly are defined as these? And perhaps this conversation has opened your eyes to some possibilities that you may not even be aware of. If you have some of these people at your table, how do you interact with them? I'd love to hear your comments down below. And I want to thank you for being here. I am Jonathan Albin, and this has been Nikos RPG's Game Master's Guide. And have a great day, and let's play.